It's my pleasure to be here. Let me express my profound gratitude to everybody who's put on the Alt Protein Conference, because you think about all of the problems that our world is facing right now, and for you all to persevere and to keep moving forward, to put on this conference, to bring all of us together virtually so that we can continue advancing the sustainable protein world. I have enormous gratitude to you all for making it happen. So in advance, thank you for all of your work to put on this conference. Now, I do want to talk about how meat companies today can win in the protein world of tomorrow. But in order to do that, I want to talk about the world of yesterday first. So let me bring you back to the year 1830, because just as it had been for thousands of years prior to 1830, the fastest mode of transportation available to humans on land had 4 legs, and it required a lot of feed. In many ways, our civilization was built on the backs of horses, quite literally. Still, several decades before the car was to become popular, right at about that time, there was a new mode of transportation coming online, in this case, really coming on 2 lines, the rail car. This was the very beginnings of a railroad system on the East Coast of the United States that were starting to be put in place, with the most ambitious project seeking to stretch all the way from Baltimore to Ohio in what would become known as the B&O Railroad. Baltimore to Ohio, the B&O Railroad, for all you monopoly players out there who like to buy that property as I do, that's where it comes from. But even then, the idea was not to run rail cars from Baltimore to Ohio on engines. It was difficult to imagine engines capable of transporting huge rail cars at a reasonable pace, let alone uphill and around curves. Rather, the B&O owners, who, by the way, included a very elderly man who'd signed the Declaration of Independence, little fun historical fact, intended for their railroad to operate the way that everything else did back then, which is to say on horsepower, albeit these horses would be dragging huge rail cars behind them on lines, enabling them to bear heavier loads. Yet in that same year of 1830, an entrepreneur named Peter Cooper was very adamant that he had invented a steam engine power rail car called the Tom Thumb. And he asserted that he could actually power the rail car all by itself without any horses at all. And just like many entrepreneurs today, Peter Cooper wanted the barons of this industry to take notice and, of course, to purchase his product. With the B&O barons actually interested, the leading stagecoach company at the time felt threatened. They touted that no machine would ever be faster than its horses. Assured of its superiority to this newcomer inventor, they challenged Cooper to a race, his Tom Thumb versus their fastest horse, to take place along a stretch of the railroad which had already had 2 parallel sets of tracks right next to each other. Convinced that his product could actually outcompete the incumbent player, the horse, Cooper accepted, and the race was on. The biological horse and the vehicle that would soon become known as the Iron Horse lined up, both dragging cars full of their human masters, and they were off to the races. At first, both the machine and the beast were running even. The suspense was thick, but eventually, the fastest horse in the land started fading. The Tom Thumb pulled ahead, impressing the naysayers and the supporters alike. Peter Cooper was so excited, yet about halfway through the race, a belt on the steam engine broke, stalling the Tom Thumb and allowing the horse to pull back into the winning slot, finishing the race in first place. Now, the stagecoach company may have been pleased with their temporary victory, but their pleasure was not sufficient to keep them in business. So assured that nothing could ever be better than a horse, they were lazy. They failed to embrace innovation. The B&O barons were so impressed by the Tom Thumb that they placed orders, launching Peter Cooper into great prominence. And by the way, a little small side note for you, Peter Cooper, in addition to inventing the first steam engine powered rail car, is also the first person to patent a method for manufacturing gelatin, something I know many of us in this conference are very interested in. And he sold that patent to the company that eventually started Jell-O. And so needless to say, Cooper died a very rich man. In fact, if you ever go to New York City and you see Cooper Union, that is in fact named after this same Peter Cooper. Now, while the Tom Thumb of 1830 could only travel 18 miles an hour, today trains are traveling at 200 miles an hour regularly. Well, they do if you're not in the United States. Here in the US, we have a high-speed rail problem, but who knows? If Elon Musk gets this way, maybe we'll be zipping around in the Hyperloop at 700 miles an hour as he predicts. So you may be wondering, okay, cool story, but what does any of this have to do with clean meat and alternative protein today? And the answer is quite a lot. If you compare the trains of 1830 to the trains of today, we know they just kept getting better and better and better. Yet how much better can a horse get? Really? Not much. How much better can the cows and the pigs and the chickens get better? The answer again is really not much. Almost infinitely, trains have gotten better to the point we're creating the hyperloop that really bears little resemblance to the train at all. Yet today we are in this comparable position with alternative proteins. Since sure, the animal-based incumbent today may win a metaphorical race with clean meat. It can win on cost, it can win on convenience, it can win on many factors. But how much better can a cow or a pig or a chicken get? Again, like a horse, not much. Yet how much better can alternative protein get? And I believe that the answer is comparable to the difference between the Tom Thumb train of 1830 and a maglev train in China today. So think about this, for example. I like to envision a world where you might walk into your friend's house, and instead of like today, where you might see a bread maker or an ice cream maker on your friend's kitchen counter, pretty unremarkable. But what if they had a meat maker? What if they could order just little tea bags full of stem cells, and you could drop them into the meat maker and they could make countertop meat right there? Now, of course, you may think that's not possible. Of course, today it isn't possible, but maglev trains weren't possible in the 1830s either. And so when you think about what might be possible in the future to totally revolutionize our food choices, the meat companies and other food companies of today are starting to recognize that indeed, we might be able to create a better food future with more novel and interesting culinary experiences than what we have had in the past. Maybe you'll go to a local pub, and instead of the pub brewing its own IPA, some artisanal brew, they're brewing their own meat. And maybe there's a pig in the backyard of the restaurant from whom those cells were derived. And maybe those, you can go and order the pork chops and then go back and tip your hat to the pig who donated the cells for those pork chops. Maybe we'll have turduckens. So if those of you don't know what a turducken is, your life is better because of it, but it's essentially a chicken stuffed inside of a turkey, stuffed inside of a duck, and you cook it all, and then you can cut it up and eat the flesh of 3 different species of birds all at one time. Why somebody would want to do this, I'm not really sure. But maybe instead of just putting one bird inside of another bird inside of another bird, maybe you could blend the cells of those 3 species of birds together and actually interweave the protein so that you could eat a real turducken. So it's almost comparable in some ways to cheese. Like if you think about the world from when we had domesticated cows, but before cheese was invented. So you had cow's milk in some humans' diets, but you didn't have cheese. In fact, no one had ever conceived of cheese. Nobody had ever dreamt of Gouda or Brie or Swiss or American or cheddar or any of these other culinary experiences that billions of people really enjoy today. Yet there was this whole world of novel culinary experiences that no one had even fantasized about because they didn't know. Well, when we start producing alternative proteins, producing proteins from animal cells, from microbial proteins, from hybridizing plants and from plant and animal proteins, from growing animal cells and making meats, you are unshackling us from the exploitation of animals, which enables us to have a much broader world of culinary experiences than we would have other had. So I think that that is the same for plant-based meat, for clean meat, and for other types of alternative proteins. And when meat companies today look at this world, here's what I think that they see. I think that they see something comparable to what happened in the film industry a few decades back, where you had Kodak and you had Canon vying for supremacy of the film market. Kodak actually invented digital film, but they were afraid it was going to cannibalize their business, their core business. And so they suppressed it, whereas Canon embraced the innovation. And we all know what happened in the end. Kodak declared bankruptcy. Canon is now the largest manufacturer of digital cameras on the planet. And forward-thinking meat companies see that story, and they all want to be Canon. They don't want to be the Kodak, and that's exactly what's happening here. So you have meat companies that are not only investing in alternative protein startups, but they're actually starting to launch their own plant-based and hybridized products into the market because they want to try to be like the Canon. They know that that might end up cannibalizing some of their conventional meat sales, but they want to be the forward-thinking companies that can win in the marketplace of the future. So what are the technologies that these companies ought to be looking for? Well, I see it as really like an all of the above approach. In other words, if you think about, let's say, like the problem of fossil fuels, you recognize that the problem of fossil fuels and climate change is so severe, it's so urgent that you don't want to just put everything, let's say, on wind or everything on solar or everything on geothermal and so on. You want lots of alternatives to fossil fuels so that you don't know which one is going to be the best, and maybe it's not going to be one at all. Maybe it's going to be a multitude of them. Well, in the same way with transportation, yes, the horse was first replaced by trains, but then by cars and planes and bikes and motorcycles, and to the dismay of many San Franciscans today, yes, scooters too. But we need many alternatives to the problem of fossil fuels, and similarly, we need many alternatives to the problems of factory farms. And so one of those alternatives that I believe is so promising is one of the least explored opportunities out there. Sure, everybody at this conference knows about clean meat. Everybody at this conference knows about plant-based meat. You're probably going to eat some of it today. But fewer people have explored this option of actually hybridizing meat. That is to say, to take plant-based protein formulas and blend them directly into meat. And here's why this is important. If you think about the world of plant-based meat, right now it's less than 1%. Less than 1% of all the meat that's produced in America and around the world is plant-based meat. Clean meat, still 0.0%. And if you look at the projections of companies like Barclays, they say that by the year 2030, 10% of all of the meat is going to be coming from alternative proteins, which is amazing. To go from under 1% to 10% in a decade, it would be hugely transformational. Billions fewer animals would be subjected to horrible conditions and slaughter. You'd have way fewer emissions. It would be a really wonderful thing. But it would still mean that 90% of animals, of meat, are coming from animals who are raised on factory farms and slaughtered. And that's just untenable. We can't get to a point 10 years from now where 90% of all the meat is still coming from the conventional way. And the reality is that Barclays is one of the more aggressive of these projections. And so I believe that we need near-term strategies as well. And so that's why I believe that hybridizing meat by utilizing plant proteins and putting it into the meat that people are already purchasing today is such a viable strategy. In the same way that electric vehicles are still less than 1% of total vehicle sales, in the same way plant-based meat is still less than 1% of total meat sales, you want to make sure that, let's say in the auto industry, that, yeah, more people are switching to electric, that's fantastic, but you also want to improve the fuel efficiency of the 99% of cars that are still being sold. That if you could get, let's say, 10 miles more per gallon for a huge portion of those cars, you end up reducing fuel usage quite a lot. Much more so than even doubling electric vehicle uptake. So in the same way that I believe that we need plant-based meat as a solution now, we also need the supplemental strategy of helping these meat companies recognize that you can continue selling meat and you can just include different ingredients in it. And that's what the premise of my own company, the Better Meat Co., is doing. I'm sitting in our headquarters right now here in Sacramento, California, and we make plant-based protein formulas. Proteins, fibers, fats, and flavors that we design and process to seamlessly blend directly in to ground beef, ground chicken, ground pork, ground turkey, fish, crab, and so on to enable the major meat users to use fewer animals. Yes, they can continue selling the same volume of product, but they don't have to make it all from slaughtered animals. And so they can come to recognize that maybe they aren't meat companies as much as they are protein companies. Maybe their customers just want that familiar experience and satiation of a high protein meal without having to have animals raised and slaughtered for it. Most people who eat meat do not eat meat because animals were slaughtered for it. In fact, they probably eat meat in spite of that fact. The chances of them wanting to see how the meat is made are very low. Well, I think it's time to offer the meat companies a way, yes, to get involved by investing in the clean meat startups, yes, to release their own brands of plant-based meat, but also to hybridize their own products that nearly everybody is buying so that they can have a lighter footprint on animals, a lighter footprint on the planet, and a lighter footprint on public health, because these blended products tend to have less saturated fat, less cholesterol, fewer calories, more fiber, and so on. So again, the idea of putting into the default items that nearly everyone is buying something that will reduce the impact of it, I think even small advancements when you're dealing with such a huge number of products can actually make a really big difference. And it's a fantastic way to get meat companies on board by dipping their toe into these alternative protein waters and enabling them to show that they too can win, that the alternative protein movement does not have to cause them to lose, but rather that they can win by embracing alternatives to the conventional system in the same way that Peter Cooper viewed transportation as something that could be really advanced and enhanced dramatically if we just freed ourselves from the exploitation of animals and enabled a much greater array of transportation options available to us. In the same way, we're going to have much greater opportunities for culinary novelty than we have had in the past. We've come a very long way since the days when trains were competing with horses. Today, alternative meats are just in the very beginning stages of their competition with conventional meat. In the United States, we produced 100 billion pounds of meat last year, 100 billion pounds of meat versus producing about 200 million pounds of plant-based meat. In other words, 99.8% of the meat that was produced in the United States last year came from conventional animal market share. But just as with the iron horse, we now call the train, when we free ourselves from the exploitation of animals, we not only advance the moral progress of our civilization, we also can lift the limits on what may be possible. And I believe that the alternative protein revolution is going to not only save humanity from some of the worst things that we are doing to the planet and to ourselves, but I believe it's going to create a much better future in which we will have much better experiences for ourselves as well. And I, for one, cannot wait to taste that more delicious, more humane, and more sustainable future. Thank you very much.